So we're going to talk about reproduction, sexual reproduction in plants. And so what I have here is just a basic diagram of a flower. This is an insect pollinated flower, and we'll talk about at the end, we'll talk about how you can tell that, okay? So there's several parts of the flower that you need to be familiar with in order to talk about sexual reproduction, all right? These here, these three, and then there's three on this side. These are called the anther. This is where the pollen is made. So the pollen is the male gamete for plants, all right? And so pollen is made in all of the anthers. This they usually don't ask about. It's called a filament. And together, these two together are called the stamen. Okay, so pollen is produced in the anther. It's the male part of the plant. And then here in the center, you have, this is the whole thing is called the ovary, just like in animals, all right? And then these little bits on the inside, this is called, those are ovules, all right? And the egg cell, the female gamete, is are located within those ovules. All right, then you have the petals. Obviously, I'm not going to label those. Those are petals. Most people know that. And then this part here that sits above the ovary, this is called the stigma. And this, the long part down to the ovary, is called the style. Right? So these are the parts, the basic parts of the plant that you'll need. By the way, these are petals. These here are called sepals, but I've never heard them ask about that. But these two things down here, all right? Now, the reason you need to know this is because you need to be able to walk through the steps of plant fertilization. And when we talk about plant sexual reproduction, it's often called double fertilization because there are actually two different fusion of nuclei or cells that occur, and so that's why it's called double fertilization. So the first thing that happens in plant double fertilization is that pollen made by the produced in the anther is moved and transported either by wind or by insect onto the stigma. So you get little pieces of pollen, okay, pollen grains that land on the stigma. And the pollen grains have two nuclei in them. They are both, all right, they have what's called the tube nucleus and also what's called the generative nucleus. So there are two nuclei that are located within this pollen grain. All right. And so the tube nucleus, as the name suggests, is responsible for basically growing a tube down the style here. Okay. And it does this by creating digestive enzymes. The digestive enzymes literally eat their way down the style and then enter into an ovule. All right. And at that point, the tube nucleus it served its purpose. We don't have to worry about it anymore. So the tube nucleus creates it's called a pollen tube. Okay. And then you have the generative nucleus. As this pollen tube is being built, the generative nucleus divides. So this is a haploid nucleus. It's haploid. But it divides by mitosis. So you're going to then end up with two haploid nuclei, and one of them is going to fertilize the egg cell. That's the actual fertilization event. But then the other one fuses with two nuclei called the polar nuclei, which are also haploid within the ovule. I'll write down these steps in a second. And so the idea is that the second generative nucleus fuses with the two polar nuclei, and those then form the triploid endosperm. And the endosperm is responsible for basically it provides food and energy and necessary nutrients to the embryo, the plant embryo, as it develops within the seed. So let me write down the steps, okay, for you down here, and then I'll talk a little more about the fate of these different parts and how that works into the final seed that is formed. Okay, so I apologize if you can hear my kid in the background. It's hard to focus a little bit. So I've just written down the steps for you here. All right, so the idea is that the pollen grain lands on the stigma. All right. Then the tube, the pollen tube, grows down the style, and that's due to the tube nucleus. The generative nucleus, which is haploid and located originally in the pollen grain, divides by mitosis, and one of those nuclei then fertilizes the egg cell, which is in the ovule, okay, here within the ovary. And the other one fuses with the polar nuclei that are already also in the ovule, and that forms the endosperm. All right. Now, why do we care about this stuff? The idea is that you need to understand the fate of the ovule, especially the ovules and the ovary, and what happens to them once that fertilization occurs. What is the equivalent of those in the seed and in the fruit? All right, so this is my awesome drawing of a seed. And so the idea is that this little thing on the inside, so this is the actual plant embryo. So that was formed by the fusion of the egg cell with one of the generative nuclei. And then here, the rest of the inside of the seed is the food storage, and this is what the endosperm is. So the endosperm, I shouldn't say food storage, it's the food supply. So this is what starts getting broken down by various enzymes when the conditions are right, when there's oxygen, warmth, and water around. Then the enzymes here will start to activate, and they'll start to break down the food supply so that the embryo can have nutrition as it grows. The other part of the seed you need to know is this. It's called the testa, or simpler name for it is the seed coat. And this is the tough outer layer of a seed. So if you go and you find a dried bean, okay, and you break it open, you'll be able to see the testa and the endosperm, and you might even be able to see a little tiny embryo if you let them, especially if you soak it in water, warm water, for a little day or so. And so the idea is that the embryo is the result of this, the generative nucleus fertilizing the egg cell. Okay, so that would be in the ovule. And then the endosperm also develops within the ovule. So the testa, what it originally started out is that it actually was the wall of the ovule. So the ovule wall actually develops into the testa. And then surrounding this seed, if you think about, for example, an apple or something like that, there's a fruit that surrounds it, right? And that fruit is actually the ovary. So what happens is after fertilization, the ovary starts to swell, and that becomes the fruit itself. And the ovules become all of the seeds, right? So I'll write that down. The ovary actually turns into the fruit. All right. So the idea is that you need to know not just how plant reproduction works and the process of double fertilization, which is fairly straightforward, but also what is the fate of these things. So the ovules turn into the seeds. The ovule wall becomes the testa. Okay. And the ovary itself becomes the fruit. Right? And the embryo is, of course, the actual little plant inside.